I stepped into the dead quiet industrial kitchen of the Midtown Atlanta branch one night, and there he was, a black man standing alone. His knife moved through vegetables with the precision of someone who had trained for years in kitchens most people couldn't get a reservation at. He didn't know I was watching him from across the room in my maintenance uniform. He didn't know I was the CEO of the company that was about to fire him. What I did next would change both of our lives. I had been wearing the same steel-toed boots for days, and they still hadn't broken in. The blisters on my heels were raw, rubbing against thick socks every time I crossed the kitchen floor. I welcomed the pain. It reminded me that this was real, not a quarterly report, not a conference call, not a spreadsheet full of numbers that reduced human beings to labor costs. I had arrived at the Midtown Atlanta branch on a Monday, introducing myself as a temporary maintenance hire. Nobody questioned it. Nobody cared. The branch was understaffed and bleeding money, and anyone willing to scrub grease traps late at night was a warm body they didn't have to fight for. The night manager barely glanced at my paperwork before handing me a mop and pointing toward the back. That was how I wanted it. Invisible, forgettable, just another tired face in a building full of them. In the early shifts, I mapped the operation with the quiet precision of someone who had built a restaurant empire from a single location. I noted the inventory mismanagement, the inconsistent food storage temperatures, the fryer that should have been replaced years ago. I cataloged everything, filed it away in my mind the way I filed away profit margins and expansion timelines. Then I noticed Jamal Brooks. He was already there when I arrived, standing at the far prep station with his back to the door. A tall man, broad-shouldered but lean in the way people get when they burn more calories than they consume. His dark skin caught the blue-white glare of the overhead lights, a faded black t-shirt, gray kitchen pants, non-slip shoes that had seen better days. He was chopping onions, and the sound stopped me mid-step. It wasn't the clumsy hacking I'd heard from most prep workers in my 20 years of running restaurants. This was something else entirely. The knife moved in a consistent, rapid rhythm. Each slice identical in width, each motion economical, wasted effort stripped away like fat from a cut of meat. His left hand curled over the onion in a perfect claw grip, fingertips tucked, knuckles guiding the blade. Textbook technique, the kind taught in culinary programs, not picked up from watching videos on a smoke break. I watched for a full minute before he even registered my presence. When he finally glanced over his shoulder, his expression didn't change. A brief nod, nothing more. Then back to the onions. Over the following shifts, I learned his pattern. Jamal arrived before anyone else on the night crew. He prepped vegetables, portioned proteins, organized the walk-in cooler, and handled whatever tasks had been left undone by the evening shift. He worked steadily, without urgency but without pause, like a man who had made peace with the mechanics of labor, the way monks made peace with silence. He never arrived late. He never left early. He never complained about the assignments, the temperature of the kitchen, or the fact that the ventilation system wheezed like a dying animal. If there was extra work, he took it. If someone called out sick, he covered. He was, by every measurable standard, the most reliable employee in the building, and nobody seemed to notice. Ryan Walsh did not notice. Ryan was the night shift manager, a compact, restless man in his mid-30s who moved through the kitchen like someone perpetually late for something more important. He wore his authority the way some men wore cheap cologne, too much, too obvious, and impossible to ignore. His management style was transactional. Tasks were distributed based on whoever was closest, and problems were solved by whoever was most willing to absorb them. That person almost always was Jamal. I watched it happen with surgical attention. One shift, Ryan assigned Jamal to unload a delivery truck after Jamal had already completed a full prep cycle of hours of continuous knife work. Ryan didn't ask. He walked past the prep station, pointed at Jamal without making eye contact, and said, "Truck's here. Handle it." Jamal set down his knife, wiped his hands on his apron, and walked toward the loading dock without a word. No please, no thank you, no use of his name. I had seen this before in my restaurants. Not cruelty, nothing dramatic enough to file a complaint about, just erasure. The quiet, systematic way certain workers became furniture. You used them, you relied on them, but you never saw them. I found myself keeping a mental file on Ryan's behavior the way I kept files on everything else. Not because he was malicious, but because he was ordinary. He was the product of a system that measured people in output and cost. And in that system, Jamal was efficient and cheap. That was all Ryan needed to know. Then something small happened. Small enough that Ryan missed it, that the security cameras wouldn't have flagged it, that no quarterly review would ever capture it. A new hire, a kid named Ethan, barely 19, with shaky hands and a face that broadcast every ounce of his anxiety, had been assigned to portion chicken breasts. He was doing it wrong. The cuts were uneven, the portions inconsistent, and he was burning through product at a rate that would have made any cost-conscious manager wince. His breathing was getting faster, his hands were getting worse. He was spiraling the way new employees spiral when they realize they're failing and nobody is coming to help. Jamal set down his own work. He walked over to Ethan's station, stood beside him, and placed one hand flat on the cutting board. Not on Ethan, not on the knife, just on the board. A grounding gesture. "Like this," Jamal said. His voice was low, steady. He picked up a chicken breast, positioned it, and made 3 clean cuts. Then he handed the knife back to Ethan. "Don't rush. The chicken's not going anywhere." Ethan laughed, a single nervous exhale, and tried again. Better this time. Jamal watched for another moment, nodded once, and returned to his own station. That was it. No lecture, no condescension, no performance for an audience. Just one person recognizing that another person was drowning and reaching out a hand. I saw the whole thing from across the kitchen, my mop moving in slow mechanical arcs. Nobody else saw it. By the end of my first week there, I had gathered everything I needed. The branch had operational issues, fixable ones, poor inventory management, outdated equipment, a night shift that was understaffed and poorly supervised. I could write my report, fly home, implement changes from behind my desk, and never think about this place again. That was the plan. That had always been the plan. But Jamal Brooks was not in the plan. I couldn't stop thinking about his hands, the way they moved over the cutting board, not like a man doing a job, but like a man practicing a craft he had been trained for and then somehow separated from. Prep work late at night was beneath his skill level, and we both knew it. Yet he showed up every shift, silent and steady, and never once indicated that he deserved better. That was the part I couldn't reconcile. In my experience, people with talent either leveraged it or resented its waste. They climbed or they burned. Jamal did neither. He simply worked. He simply endured. And the question that kept circling back, the one I couldn't answer from behind the safe distance of a clipboard and a cover story, was the simplest one. Why? Why did a man with the hands of a trained chef accept the worst shift, the lowest position, and the complete invisibility that came with both? As the sky outside the kitchen's narrow windows shifted from black to a bruised purple one morning, I made my decision. I wasn't leaving. Not yet. I told myself it was professional, that understanding Jamal could help me understand the systemic failures that allowed someone like him to fall through the cracks. But that was the version I could put in a memo. The truth was messier. The truth was that I had spent night after night watching a man pour himself into a building that didn't even know his name. And I wanted to know what was holding him together. This was no longer about evaluating a system. This was about one person. The second week was harder than the first, not physically. I had adjusted to the mop, the bleach, the hours that turned my internal clock inside out. The difficulty was Jamal himself. Getting close to him was like trying to hold water. Every time I thought I had found an opening, it slipped through. I started small. A comment about the weather as I refilled the mop bucket near his station. A question about whether the walk-in cooler had always made that rattling sound. The kinds of things coworkers said to each other late at night when the silence became too heavy. Jamal responded to all of it. He was never rude, never dismissive. He would answer my question, yes, the cooler had rattled like that since last winter, and then return to his work with a finality that made it clear the conversation was over. He had a way of closing doors without slamming them. Polite, practiced, absolute. Over the next shifts, I pieced together fragments, not from what Jamal said, but from what he didn't. He never mentioned anyone waiting for him at home. He never talked about weekends, hobbies, or plans. When other night crew members, there were only 2 others, both part-timers who treated the shift like a sentence to be endured, complained about missing a concert or a friend's birthday, Jamal listened without contributing. He existed in the present tense of the kitchen, as if the world outside its walls didn't apply to him. But certain details leaked through despite his discipline. He always refused day shifts. I had overheard Ryan offering him one, not out of kindness, but because a daytime prep worker had quit without notice and the branch was desperate. The day shift paid more per hour. Jamal turned it down without explanation. Ryan shrugged and moved on. To him, it was one less problem to solve. To me, it was another piece of a puzzle I couldn't yet see. There was also the phone. Jamal kept it in his back pocket, always on vibrate. Most shifts it stayed silent, but as his shift neared its end, the phone would buzz sometimes, once, sometimes 3 or 4 times in quick succession. Jamal would glance at the screen, and something in his expression would shift. Not alarm, not annoyance, something closer to gravity, a pull from somewhere outside the kitchen that he acknowledged but never acted on during work hours. He never answered. He never stepped away. He just looked and then kept cutting. And he always left the moment his shift ended, not a minute before, not a minute after. Other workers lingered, finishing a cigarette by the back door, scrolling through their phones in the break room, stretching out the transition between work and whatever waited on the other side. Jamal clocked out and disappeared. Every single shift, like a man keeping a promise to someone who was counting the minutes. I filed all of it away. I was building a portrait from negative space, not what Jamal showed the world, but the shape of everything he was hiding. One morning, I found the first real edge of the picture. My shift ended, and I peeled off my rubber gloves, hung my apron in the maintenance closet, and walked out through the back exit into the gray light of early dawn. The parking lot was nearly empty. A few cars belonging to the morning crew just arriving, the dumpsters lined up against the far wall like sleeping animals. Jamal's car was parked in the corner farthest from the building, an older sedan, dark blue with a dent in the rear fender and a child's car seat visible through the back window. He was sitting in the driver's seat with his head resting against the steering wheel, not sleeping, just still. His eyes were closed, and his chest rose and fell with the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone gathering himself, pulling the pieces back together before facing whatever came next. I watched from a distance, standing near the exit door with my jacket half zipped. After a long moment, Jamal lifted his head. He rubbed his face with both hands, started the engine, and drove out of the lot without looking back. I stood there for a while after he was gone, staring at the empty parking space. The child's car seat. That detail sat in my chest like a stone. The next shift, it happened without either of us planning it. The kitchen was quieter than usual. One of the part-timers had called out, leaving only Jamal and me in the building for the first hours of the shift. We worked in parallel silence, Jamal at his station, me cleaning the floor drains nearby. Around the middle of the shift, Jamal walked to the small alcove near the dry storage shelves where employees sometimes sat during breaks. He leaned against the wall, a paper cup of water in his hand, and closed his eyes. I was wiping down the shelving unit beside him. I didn't say anything. I just worked, letting the quiet do what quiet sometimes does between two people who have occupied the same space long enough to stop performing. Jamal spoke first. His voice was low, almost to himself, as if he was thinking out loud rather than starting a conversation. I have to be home before the morning rush. I kept wiping. I didn't turn. Early riser? Jamal took a slow sip of water. My son, he's 4. He wakes up around then, and if I'm not there, he gets scared. The words landed in the space between us with the weight of something that had been carried alone for a very long time. I let them settle before responding. No one else at home to be with him? Jamal looked down at the paper cup in his hand, turning it slowly between his fingers. No, it's just us. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The sentence held everything. Every refused day shift, every unanswered phone buzz, every sprint to the parking lot the moment the clock released him. Jamal wasn't choosing the night shift, he was choosing his son. The night was the only window where he could work without leaving a 4-year-old alone. I felt something tighten behind my ribs, not pity, recognition. I had built my company by understanding systems, but this was not a system. This was a man who had divided himself in two, father by day, laborer by night, and was running on whatever was left in between. I wanted to ask more. I didn't. Jamal had given me a small, precise piece of himself, and pushing further would have broken whatever fragile trust had allowed him to offer it. Over the following shifts, the picture filled in not through interrogation, but through the natural accumulation of proximity and time. Ethan, the young new hire Jamal had helped during my first week, turned out to be a talker. He admired Jamal with the unguarded openness of someone too young to know that admiration could make people uncomfortable. One shift, while Jamal was in the walk-in cooler, Ethan mentioned something to me as I mopped near his station. "You know, you used to work at Carmichael's, right? Downtown, the real one, not the catering side." I knew Carmichael's. Everyone in the restaurant industry knew Carmichael's. It was one of the most respected kitchens in the city, the kind of place where line cooks trained for years just to earn a permanent station. "He told you that?" I asked. Ethan shook his head. "Nah, he doesn't talk about himself like that. I looked him up after he showed me that chicken thing. Found an old article about Carmichael's kitchen team from years ago. He's in the photo, standing right next to the head chef." Ethan pulled out his phone and scrolled. I didn't ask to see the photo. I didn't need to. The knife work, the claw grip, the instinct to teach, it all made sense now. Jamal hadn't learned to cook in a place like this. He had trained in a kitchen where precision was a language, and he still spoke it fluently. What I couldn't understand, what the photo and Ethan's gossip couldn't explain, was how a man with that background had ended up doing overnight prep in a failing branch of a mid-tier restaurant chain, earning barely enough to keep the lights on. The answer came a few shifts later, not from Ethan, not from snooping, but from Jamal himself. It was close to the end of a slow shift. Jamal was cleaning his station, the final ritual of every shift performed with the same care he gave the first cut of the night. I was nearby emptying a trash bin. Something about the hour or the fatigue or the fact that we had now shared enough silent shifts to build a kind of wordless trust made Jamal talk. He told me about his mother. She had gotten sick 2 years ago, a stroke that left her partially paralyzed and in need of daily care. His wife had left before that, when their son was still an infant. Jamal had managed for a while, juggling day shifts and a rotating cast of babysitters he couldn't afford. But when his mother's condition worsened, the math stopped working. He couldn't pay for childcare, elder care, and rent on a cook's salary. Not in this city, not at the hours a real kitchen demanded. So he made a choice. He left Carmichael's. He found a job that would let him work while his son slept, be home before the boy woke up, care for his mother during the day while the boy was at a neighbor's, and sleep in whatever fractured hours remained. It wasn't a career. It was a survival schedule built around 2 people who needed him more than he needed a future. He told me all of this in the same tone he used to give Ethan instructions, calm, factual, stripped of self-pity as if he were describing a recipe. Step 1, wake up. Step 2, keep going. Step 3, repeat. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I asked one question. "Do you miss it? Cooking? I mean, real cooking." Jamal rinsed his knife under the faucet and dried it with a clean towel, taking his time with the blade. "Missing it doesn't change anything." That was the last thing he said before clocking out. 2 weeks into my time at the branch, a company-wide memo arrived. I knew about it before it was posted. I had approved the policy myself months ago from a conference room far away, restructuring night operations across underperforming locations, reducing overnight staffing to skeleton crews, eliminating redundant prep positions. The language was clean, strategic, the kind of language that looked responsible in a board presentation. Projected savings of millions annually, improved operational efficiency, streamlined labor allocation. Ryan posted the memo on the break room bulletin board one morning right before the night crew arrived. He delivered the news the way he delivered everything, quickly, without ceremony, already mentally moving to the next task. "Corporate's cutting night shifts at lower-performing branches," Ryan said to the small group gathered in the break room. "This location's on the list. Some positions are getting eliminated. You'll know by the end of the month." Jamal stood near the back wall, arms at his sides. His face revealed nothing. When the room cleared, he approached Ryan. I was mopping the hallway just outside the break room door, close enough to hear. "When does it take effect?" Jamal asked. His voice was even. Ryan checked his phone. "Probably a few weeks." They were still finalizing. Jamal nodded once, then walked to his station and began prepping as if nothing had changed. Later, when Jamal was out of earshot, Ryan leaned against the break room doorframe and said something to me as I passed. "Guys like him always land on their feet. Don't worry about it." He said it casually, the way people say things about other people's lives when they've never had to fight for their own. I didn't respond. I pushed my mop forward and kept moving. The days after the announcement, Jamal didn't change his routine. He still arrived first. He still prepped with the same mechanical precision. He still left the moment his shift ended. But I noticed things that weren't there before. The slight tremor in his left hand during the later hours. The way his eyes unfocused for a second too long when he reached for a new bunch of carrots. The deepening shadows beneath his eyes that even the harsh fluorescent light couldn't wash out. He was running out, not all at once. Jamal was not the kind of man who fell apart in public, but the reserves he had been drawing from, the ones that let him split himself between father and worker and caretaker, were draining faster than he could refill them. The announcement hadn't broken him. It had simply added weight to a load that was already at its limit. It happened one shift shortly after the memo went up. Jamal was halfway through his prep cycle, the kitchen silent except for the wheeze of the ventilation system. Not a cry for help, just a body that had reached the end of what willpower could demand of it. Jamal sat there breathing slowly, staring at his own hands as if they belonged to someone else. And for the first time since I had walked into this kitchen, I did not feel like an observer. I felt like a witness. There was a difference. Observers collected data. Witnesses carried responsibility. I sat with him until his breathing steadied. I didn't touch him, didn't offer comfort, didn't say it would be okay. I just stayed. And in the terrible quiet of that kitchen under lights that made everything look clinical and cold, I understood something that no report, no policy review, no boardroom discussion had ever made clear. This was what the numbers looked like when they were a person. I drove back to my hotel that morning with the window down, letting the cold air cut across my face. The city was waking up around me. Delivery trucks, early joggers, the first buses grinding along their routes. But I saw none of it. I saw Jamal on the kitchen floor. I saw Ryan checking his phone. I saw a half-cut bell pepper sitting on the edge of a cutting board like a sentence left unfinished. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, still in my maintenance uniform, and opened my laptop. The restructuring memo was in my inbox, the same one Ryan had pinned to the break room bulletin board. I'd read it dozens of times before. I'd helped draft it. The language was mine. Streamlined labor allocation, projected savings of millions annually, optimized staffing models for underperforming locations. I read it again now, and every word felt different. Not wrong exactly, worse than wrong, indifferent. The memo didn't account for a man who worked through the night so his 4-year-old son wouldn't wake up alone. It didn't account for a former chef who had traded his career for a survival schedule. It didn't account for a body collapsing on a kitchen floor because there was nothing left to give. The memo didn't account for Jamal because it wasn't designed to, and I had designed it. I closed the laptop. The question I had been circling for days finally landed with its full weight. If I walked away now, packed up my cover story and flew home to make adjustments from the safe distance of a corporate office, how was I any different from Ryan? Ryan didn't see Jamal because he didn't care to look. I had looked. I'd seen everything. And silence after seeing was not neutrality. It was a choice. I spent the rest of that day making a different one. The next evening, I arrived at the restaurant an hour before the night shift began. I had changed out of the maintenance uniform. I wore my own clothes. Simple, professional, nothing extravagant. I carried no clipboard, no folder, no props. I waited in the break room. Jamal walked in at his usual time. He stopped when he saw me sitting at the table dressed differently, looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen before. "I need to talk to you," I said, "and I need you to hear the whole thing before you decide what to do with it." Jamal set his bag down slowly. He didn't sit. I told him all of it. I told him my real name, my title, the reason I had come to this branch in the first place. I told him I was the CEO of the company that employed him, the same company that had issued the memo threatening to eliminate his position. I told him I had spent weeks mopping floors and watching him work, and that nothing I had seen from the inside of this building matched what I had believed from the outside. Jamal listened without moving. His face went through something that was hard to read, not shock, not relief, a slow, careful rearrangement, like a man reassessing every interaction of the past weeks through a new lens. Every question I had asked him, every moment I had been nearby, the shift he told me about his son, the morning I saw him in the parking lot. When I finished, the silence between us was heavy enough to press against the walls. Jamal looked at the floor, then at me. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but it carried an edge I had never heard from him before. So all this time, the mop, the uniform, the questions, I was being watched. It wasn't a question. It was a statement delivered with the controlled precision of a man who had learned long ago to hold his anger in both hands. You stood there and watched me fall apart on that kitchen floor, and you knew. You knew who you were the whole time. I held his gaze. I didn't flinch, didn't reach for justification. Yes, Was I a project? Jamal asked, his jaw tightened. Something to put in a report? A story for the next board meeting about how the CEO really cares? I came here for the system, I said. I stayed because of you. That's the truth. And I know it doesn't make it better. You trusted someone who wasn't real, and I can't undo that. If you don't want to hear anything else from me, I'll respect it. Jamal picked up his bag. He walked past me through the break room door and into the kitchen. A few seconds later, I heard the back exit open and close. He didn't come in for his next shift. I didn't call him. I didn't send a message through Ryan or ask Ethan if he had heard anything. I had made my disclosure. And now the only thing I could offer Jamal was the one thing no one in his life seemed to give him: space to decide on his own terms. 2 shifts passed. On the third, Jamal walked into the kitchen a few minutes later than usual. He put on his apron, pulled his knife roll from his bag, and set up his station. I was in the break room, still in my own clothes. I hadn't picked up a mop since the night I told him. Jamal appeared in the doorway. He didn't sit down. He looked at me the way someone looks at a locked door they're deciding whether to open. "What are you going to do?" he asked. 4 words. No anger this time, but no warmth either. Just a man standing at the edge of something, asking whether the ground ahead was solid. I didn't make promises. I laid out what I intended plainly, the way Jamal himself spoke, without decoration. I was restructuring the night shift policy, not just at this branch, but across the chain. The blanket elimination of overnight positions would be replaced with a flexible scheduling model that accounted for employees whose circumstances required non-traditional hours: single parents, caregivers, people whose lives didn't fit inside a 9-to-5 frame. It wasn't charity. It was an operational correction. The old policy had been built on the assumption that all labor was interchangeable. It wasn't. I was implementing a support program for employees with caregiving responsibilities, subsidized childcare referrals, emergency family assistance, healthcare benefits extended to dependents. Again, not for Jamal specifically, but for everyone the system had been ignoring. And for Jamal himself, I was offering him a place in the company's internal culinary training program, a path back to the work he had been trained for, structured around a schedule that wouldn't force him to choose between his son and his craft. Not a promotion handed down out of pity. A door opened because he had already proven every night for months that he belonged on the other side of it. I also told him I would be having a conversation with Ryan, not to fire him. Ryan wasn't cruel, just blind in the way the system had taught him to be. He would be enrolled in a management development program, one that taught supervisors to see the people behind the positions. The problem had never been Ryan alone. It was the culture that produced him. Jamal listened to all of it. He didn't nod. He didn't thank me. He stood in the doorway with his arms at his sides, processing it the way he processed everything. Internally, methodically, without performance. Finally, he said, "I'm going to finish my shift." He turned and walked back to his station. A moment later, the familiar sound of his knife filled the kitchen, steady, precise, unbroken. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't gratitude. It was something more honest than either. It was a man picking up his knife and continuing because that was what he had always done. The only difference was that now someone had finally built a floor beneath him. A few months later, the Midtown Atlanta branch kitchen looked different in the early morning light. New equipment had replaced the wheezing ventilation system. The fryer that should have been swapped out years ago was gone. The fluorescent lights still buzzed, but someone had replaced the flickering tubes, and the light fell evenly now across the stainless steel surfaces. Jamal stood at the main prep station during the early morning shift, not the graveyard hours anymore, but a window that let him work while his son spent mornings with a licensed caregiver, one arranged through the company's new family assistance program. It was the first time in years Jamal hadn't had to build his entire life around the hours between midnight and dawn. He was halfway through the culinary training program, and the change showed not in his technique, that had always been there, but in the way he occupied the kitchen. He moved like someone who belonged, not someone who was borrowing space. Beside him stood a new hire, a woman in her 20s, nervous the way Ethan had once been nervous, fumbling with a mandolin she clearly hadn't used before. Jamal reached over and adjusted her grip, guiding the angle of the blade without taking the tool from her hands. "Slow down," he said. "You're not racing anyone." She nodded and tried again. Better. Someone from the morning crew walked past and stopped, watching Jamal work for a moment. "Where'd you learn to cut like that?" he asked. Jamal looked up. For just a moment, something crossed his face. Not the guarded blankness I had seen for weeks, but something softer. A flicker of the man he had been before the world demanded he become something smaller. He smiled. It was brief, barely there, but it was real. "Long time ago," Jamal said. Then he turned back to the cutting board. "I was not in the kitchen that morning. I was hundreds of miles away in a conference room reviewing the rollout of the flexible scheduling initiative across more branches. I would never mop another floor. I would never stand in a parking lot watching a man rest his head against a steering wheel. That chapter was closed. But the system I had changed kept running without me, and that I had come to understand was the whole point. The measure of what I had done was not in the moment I revealed myself or the promises I made in a break room late at night. It was in this: a kitchen operating quietly in the morning, a man teaching someone how to hold a blade, a 4-year-old boy who no longer woke up in an empty house. Sometimes the strongest people don't need to be saved. They just need to be seen. And maybe that's the thing worth remembering, not just from Jamal's story, but from any moment when we walk past someone working in silence, carrying more than we'll ever know. You don't have to be a CEO to change someone's life. You just have to be the person who stops, looks, and decides that what you see matters. If this story stayed with you even a little, then carry it forward. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this about ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the quietest corners of the world, subscribe and stick around, because every week we find another story that deserves to be told. And the next one might be the one that changes how you see the person standing right next to you. Sometimes the most powerful lessons in life don't come from grand speeches or dramatic turning points. They arrive in the quiet hours when no one else is watching. In that dimly lit Atlanta kitchen, I learned something that still sits heavy in my chest. The strongest people among us often carry burdens we can barely imagine, yet they keep showing up day after day with steady hands and silent grace. Jamal didn't ask for recognition. He didn't broadcast his sacrifices or wear his exhaustion like a badge. He simply showed up for his little boy who needed him at dawn, for his mother who depended on him through the daylight hours, and for a job that barely saw him as a person. Watching him taught me that true strength isn't loud or flashy. It's the quiet endurance of someone who chooses love over ambition, responsibility over rest, and presence over praise, even when the world keeps reducing them to just another name on a schedule. That realization hit me like a wave because I had almost missed it. I had walked into that kitchen thinking I was there to fix a broken system with numbers and policies. Instead, I discovered that systems are made of people, real people with heartbeats, fears, and 4-year-olds who wake up scared if daddy isn't home. The deepest lesson? Sometimes all it takes to change a life is to truly see someone. Not as labor cost, not as output, but as a human being worthy of dignity and opportunity. When we pause long enough to look beyond the surface, we stop erasing each other. We start building floors instead of letting good people fall through cracks. And in doing so, we don't just help them. We remind ourselves what it means to be fully human. If Jamal's story touched something inside you, if it made you think about the invisible heroes in your own life, the late-night workers, the single parents, the quiet caregivers, tell me in the comments. Who is the person you've started seeing differently because of this? Share their story or your own quiet moment of realization. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if stories like this move you, the kind that reach into your heart and gently shift how you see the world, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Every week I bring you more real-life tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the shadows. Together, let's keep reminding each other that kindness, attention, and courage still matter. See you in the next one.